Thank you for watching our presentation on how an outside perspective can help an organization enhance its supply chain risk management strategy. Our team on this effort, which co-authored our article and is now giving this presentation, includes Mercyhurst professors Dr. Fred Hoffman, Dr. Raj Kamal Keshawarni, and Mercyhurst student Jacob Maynard. The three of us were asked to support a government contractor that had been hired by a government client to help it reform its risk management strategy. This presentation and our article is about the benefit of bringing in an outside perspective when looking to update your risk management strategy. To start with, let's examine why it has become increasingly necessary to pay attention to your company's supply chain. 100 years ago, successful companies like Ford Motor Company were widely successful in producing motor cars, in no small measure because the company owned all the commercial entities that contributed the various component parts and raw materials to the production of its motor cars. For example, Ford not only produced their own tires for their automobiles, they also owned the Indonesian rubber plants that produced the rubber for those tires, and they owned the shipping lines that transported the Indonesian rubber back to Detroit. Today, in the information age, vertically integrated supply chains like this are a rarity because of globalization. Companies retain their core competencies but outsource other tasks to outside firms that can provide raw materials and components more efficiently and at lower cost. While this has proven to be more efficient and to cost less, this trend has also made supply chains increasingly complex and subject to disruption. Not only commercial firms, but also government activities have become reliant on specialized external providers for various commodities. Government organizations also have additional supply chain vulnerabilities. For example, there may be too few interested qualified vendors that meet government standards. The government may have unique production requirements or place orders that are simply too small to interest a large number of prospective vendors. Like risk management in general, supply chain risk management also gives companies and government organizations four choices: risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk mitigation, and risk transfer. One choice that does not exist is risk elimination. An organization must then consider the probability of a particular risk and also the severity of the risk's impact should it arise. Especially for a government client, it is essential to think about supply chain risk management correctly. We began our work looking at the client's existing risk management strategy and situation. What we found were some vexing problems. First, the government client had multiple supporting reporting elements that lacked a shared understanding of risk and varied in their reporting of risk. The second major problem was that those multiple supporting elements had a small number of actual and prospective vendors. In other words, an unanticipated downstream supply chain disruption could very quickly become a major upstream headache for the government client organization. Based on our initial assessment of the client's existing supply chain situation, we recommended to the government client that they approach supply chain risk management, or SCRM, be aggregating, categorizing, subcategorizing, and quantifying risk. Now, we'll talk more about these steps momentarily. What the government client told us they gained from having an outside perspective, which we provided, were several things. First, the ability to avoid groupthink. Second, the infusion of risk management expertise. Our three-person team consisted of a certified supply chain professional, an engineer skilled at risk management, and a bright, capable student who was pursuing a degree in intelligence studies. Rather than attempt to reinvent the wheel, our team reviewed the available, unclassified literature to see how other government or commercial entities approached and managed similar supply chain challenges. Like our own client, other entities with multi-tiered supply chains suffered decreased visibility and the lack of consensus on what exactly constituted risk. We saw how lower-level supply chain disruptions could produce a ripple effect upstream. Ford, which owed its initial growth in the 1920s and its success to a vertically integrated supply chain, but has since diversified because of globalization, recently learned this particular lesson when a supply chain disruption impacted its production of the F-150 pickup truck. What organizations must strive for is resilience, or the ability to adapt and recover from a supply chain disruption. Resiliency, however, is not magic. It only becomes possible when companies adequately and accurately assess ahead of time the potential for a risk to become reality and effectively plan for alternative courses of action in response. This is what supply chain resource management is all about. Our government client had some additional challenges, though. It needed to consider nefarious actors that might attempt to willfully disrupt its supply chain. It had to exercise strict control over its supply chain, and it had stringent requirements for critical components for things such as weapon systems and spacecraft components that could be produced by a very limited number of acceptable vendors. Our team's approach was a strategy of comprehensive risk management rather than a focus on specific disruptions. One thing we noticed was that the unclassified available SCRM literature paid very limited attention to risk monitoring or detecting a minor problem before it had a chance to become a major problem. Based on our review of the literature, we proposed to the client that they adopt a holistic approach to SCRM and rethink SCRM in a way that would address some of the vulnerabilities we talked about earlier. We also encouraged them to ensure that all levels of the organization have a shared understanding of what was at risk, what the likelihood of those risks were, and what the severity of impact would be if a risk materialized. This approach would help suppress bias while enabling the organization and its disparate reporting elements to have a common understanding of risk and a shared approach to risk management. Finally, we encouraged the government client to assess their supply chain situation from multiple perspectives, educated them on different types of analytic bias, and encouraged them to consider the supply chain situation from multiple perspectives. Our methodology was as follows. First, we examined risk management literature from both relevant government agencies and also the private sector to see how comparable organizations with similar challenges handled supply chain risk management. The government shared with us a representative sample of the risk assessment documentation submitted by their various reporting units. In addition to the government client's headquarters, with which we work directly, there were well over a dozen geographically dispersed subordinate organizations, each reporting their own risk assessment. The fact that subordinate units did not consistently identify risk makes comprehensive risk assessment throughout the organization extremely difficult. The government client needed to assess risk vertically, identify common factors, and establish mitigating policies. Given the information presented to us, we sat down to create, quantify, test, and standardize a risk framework that would work for the entire organization. The intent was to develop a standardized risk matrix that could be used not only by the government client's headquarters, but also by each of its various supporting elements. The risk matrix we proposed categorized and subcategorized risk in ways that were consistent throughout the organization, with consistent definitions and a shared understanding throughout the organization as to what each risk was. We then proposed a schema for quantifying risks and developed a methodology for aggregating and visualizing those risks. Open source research provided us with ideas for useful frameworks and suitable SCRM approaches. Our government clients' risks were significant but not unique. We learned about scope, scalability, and lessons learned from other organizations. We were supplier-focused in that we did supply chain decomposition to tiers that we then mapped. We were also product-focused in that we decomposed particular products and then examined risk at the component level. We were also risk-focused in that we viewed risk individually, quantified each risk, and then quantified the risks that we found in terms of both likelihood and severity. The framework we created was derived in part from the lessons learned by other organizations and was also scalable by our government client. Our aim was not only to create a consistent and comprehensive framework for identifying, measuring, and reporting risk, but to help the government client achieve the first steps toward resiliency. After the government client presented us with risk reporting documents from some of their reporting units, we encouraged them to provide us with more such information. We then set about categorizing and subcategorizing risk in ways that worked for the various reporting units. Our risk definitions were consistent and acceptable to these subordinate organizations. We created a Microsoft Excel-based risk register that enabled those responsible for SCRM to automate, calculate, and identify leading risks throughout the organization. This had not been possible before. We then assessed the likelihood for identified risks on a scale of 1 to 25. For impacts, we considered both cost and schedule consequences. For cost risk, the metric was based on the percentage of the project budget rather than on a fixed number. This approach resulted in accurate risk scores relative to size, budget, and capabilities. Once we had standardized risk descriptions for the entire client organization and established the way to quantify those risks, we turned our attention to categorizing and subcategorizing those risks. The first step was to create the categories and subcategories. The second step was to create a handling strategy consisting of a stoplight chart indicating the greatest risks from each site by category. We also plotted a site bar graph which depicted the site's risk performance relative to others. The third step was to produce a procurement strategy graph. Our approach to the government client supply chain risk management problem demonstrated to our client the value of bringing in outsiders to look at a strategic problem from a fresh perspective. Through our efforts, the client gained 3 significant insights. First, the client saw that one subordinate reporting site had significantly higher risk than the other subordinate reporting sites. Second, our client was able to assess our standard risk matrix and realize that they had dependency on a high-risk supplier. Knowing this enabled the client to start thinking of ways to respond if that supply experienced supply chain problems or became unavailable for whatever reason, which is the first step toward resiliency for the government client. As a result of the risk management framework we had proposed, the government client became more capable of devising effective risk response strategies focused on those higher risks. There were several takeaways from our attempt to assist a government client in its efforts to rethink their supply chain risk management problem. Our involvement in their strategic effort demonstrated the value of incorporating an outside perspective. Although we developed and proposed an effective supply chain risk management framework, we freely conceded the value of examining existing literature on this issue. Although a government client felt they were unique, the reality was they shared some of the same problems and challenges as other government and private sector organizations. At the same time, however, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to SCRM. Although it is helpful to see how others approach risk management, each organization that engages in SCRM needs to have some flexibility in addressing problems or aspects of problems that may be unique. Effective communication is also extremely important, not just between us and the client, but also between the client and its multiple subordinate reporting elements. One of the big wins in this effort is getting all subordinate reporting elements to have a shared understanding of risk, for example. SCRM is not a once-and-done activity. It needs to be an ongoing process. And finally, we successfully conveyed to the client that a good strategy for building resiliency is to start by identifying risks, quantifying them, and determining which risks would have the greatest impact on the organization, and then conceptualizing strategies for how to deal with those risks if they materialize. The time to think about risk response is not when a risk becomes a reality. Planning and preparation is required to build resiliency. Thank you.